We can do all of the things the world tells us we need to do to live rich, fulfilling lives. And it's a false promise that actually doesn't lead to where we hope it will lead. Experiences that we usually look to for happiness are fragile. They're fragile because they're based on causes and conditions. And those causes and conditions, when they change, our sense of well-being changes. And you need to start by saying that there is something that just is not working in my life right now. I'm doing the same things over and over again, and somehow I'm expecting a different result. So that recognition, that insight, it's not the end of the story, but it's the beginning of the story. The question of how and why we suffer, how we get stuck in patterns of stress and anxiety and overwhelm and dissatisfaction, the answer to that the Buddha discovered is that it all comes down to how we construct our sense of self. For me, science and spirituality and meditation were really never different things, because I started meditating when I was 19. I was in college and I was really, really anxious at the time. Actually, that was the big catalyst for me. I was super intensely anxious, and I was just looking for something to help with that. And I got interested in meditation and science at the same time. So for me, it was really just a process of exploring my mind and working with my emotions. And I found both scientific research, psychology, philosophy, and especially meditation were all helpful in different ways. So that's carried through for my entire life. And people tend to think that my scientific life and my life as a meditation teacher or a Buddhist scholar are totally different things. But for me, it's just always been the exploration of the mind and trying to understand the nature of reality. So there's actually, the science of well-being goes back decades and decades. And in some respects, in Western philosophy and Western psychology, it goes back millennia. But scientists have really tried to understand what well-being is, what are the main dimensions of well-being. And the work that we do is especially focused on how you cultivate well-being. So when we looked at mental health, well-being, human flourishing, what we found is that most scientists tend to think about it as something you just kind of either have or you don't have. And they might get at very specific dimensions of it, but it's really looked at as kind of a static phenomenon. It's just something you're kind of hardwired to have. So if you have a certain amount of empathy, for example, you are just born with a certain predisposition for that. But what you see in the world's meditative traditions is, of course, that you can cultivate these things, that they're practices. So from a scientific perspective, that's what we're most interested in. It's not only what are the most important dimensions of well-being, but in particular how you can cultivate it, how you can learn to flourish, how you can train your mind and transform your mind to experience more well-being. That's, from a scientific point of view, that's the main question we're interested in. Yeah, I mean, I think all of us have beliefs, usually they're unconscious beliefs, that we don't even realize are limiting our perception. They're shaping how we see ourselves, they're influencing how we see the world. And a huge part of the path is first bringing all of that up to the surface of consciousness, so we can be a little bit more aware of all of the limiting beliefs and ideas we have. And then you just start to explore those. Like for me, I saw that when I first started meditating, I tended to equate my very identity with my emotional patterns. For example, I just thought, I'm an anxious person. So for example, I used to have a really strong phobia of public speaking. So sitting here and doing something like this would have completely freaked me out. But when I started to meditate, I started to look at that. Is that actually true? What is anxiety? And what does it mean to think of myself as an anxious person? And you basically start to see that all of these beliefs are really not only oversimplifications, but usually they distort the way we actually are. They distort the way we see the world. And that transforms things that can cause us to suffer, ultimately lead to great insights. So the very things that we try to run from in life oftentimes become huge catalysts for growth. Yeah, I don't even to think of oneself as being good at meditating. I think a lot of what the process of meditation is all about is just being willing to explore really. It's really more about curiosity than it is getting really, really good at something. Unless you want to say you get good at being curious. Maybe that you could perhaps say is what you're really good at. So at the beginning, I think many of us start meditating, just like we start anything new in life, where we have a lot of expectations. We think if we meditate, our mind is going to be calmer, or we're going to be less emotional, or it's going to help with our relationships, or whatever it is that motivates us to start to meditate. But over time, those expectations become less and less important, and the process of exploration itself is what becomes meaningful and becomes rewarding. So it becomes less about, I think, really getting good at things than just understanding your own mind and gaining insight into how it works. It's ironic that I started meditating with a complete aversion to religion and to Buddhism. So it's funny that I ended up writing books about Buddhism and I've spent so much of my life studying it. When I first started meditating, I was interested in the practical side of meditation, just how you work with emotions, how you get to understand the mind and things like that. But when I read about Buddhism, at the beginning, the philosophy felt very dry and theoretical to me. Some of the more traditional stuff just kind of felt antiquated. It didn't really speak to me. And looking back on that, I think what it was that I just didn't understand some of the more traditional things. And the philosophy, which has been really, really helpful in my life, I didn't see it wasn't just a set of ideas. It wasn't about having some conceptual roadmap of the world. The ideas are jumping off points to explore inner experience. And from that point of view, then the philosophy is incredibly helpful and incredibly rich and helpful in a very practical way. But at the beginning, I didn't see that. So for me, it probably took, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years for me to shift from being interested in meditation and really passionately interested in meditation to the point where I got interested more in the traditional roots of Buddhism. But when I did, I started to see there was so much more room to explore that I just had an allergy to it at the beginning, but once I opened up to it, I found it really helpful. I think whether or not you need religion or some spiritual belief system, I don't think that is so much the important thing as what it is that you're oriented to in your practice, and in particular what the motivation is. So you can be really Buddhist or really Hindu or really a Christian meditator and have a strong belief system, and yet your unconscious motivation could be very self-serving. It could be you simply want to be less stressed out in your life or more balanced. On the other hand, you could be, quote unquote, secular meditator who might not affiliate with any particular religion, but you might have a deeply compassionate motivation. You might really think about your own meditative journey, not only for yourself, but to do good in the world and to bring more peace into the world, whatever that might be. So I think, I tend to think it's less about having to have a specific belief system, although that can help, than really being reflective about why you do what you do, why you meditate, why you're on whatever journey you're on, and trying to find a motivation that brings together wisdom and compassion. And there's many different ways to do that. But of course, the religious traditions, spiritual traditions, provide kind of a roadmap to do that. So in some sense, it's probably helpful to have a lot of that support. So in addition to my training as a Buddhist scholar and a translator and a meditation teacher, I'm also a scientist. So I tend to think about things from a scientific perspective. And what we know scientifically is that our biology, our brain are really built for learning and for growth and transformation. In fact, the brain is changing all the time. It's changing constantly in response to experience. Even our genetics, we used to think that we had this genetic heritage. We have our genome, and it's a set point. But actually now we know that our genes are almost like little volume knobs. Our genes can be expressed to varying degrees. So there's a whole field of what we call epigenetics that looks at how the expression of our genes changes in response to various experiences. So you could say that we're constantly changing. The change is actually the norm in our nervous system, in our brain, and certainly in our mind. But the question is, are we doing that consciously or not? Usually the changes that are happening are not conscious. So we're all participating in this huge social experiment in which we're carrying around these little devices. The average person picks up their phone 150 times a day, believe it or not. That's kind of crazy, but it's true. So if you imagine that that is shaping not only your mind, but that is activating your nervous system, it's triggering certain brain states, your brain is being rewired, in this case by your device and what you do on your smartphone every time you turn it on. So all of these forces, like technology, are shaping our experience and our biology. With meditation, we're taking that same biological and even psychological capacity we have for change, for learning, for growth, and the only thing we're adding to it is intention. We're just doing what normally happens unconsciously without intention, and now we're doing it with intention. And that intention can change. It can be to be less stressed out, it can be to be more compassionate, it can be to do good in the world, it can be to improve relationships. You can have many different intentions for it. But the key is that you're consciously doing it rather than letting the forces around you shape your mind and brain unconsciously. So that, I think, it's something that we've discovered recently through scientific research, but the world's meditative traditions, of course, have known this for thousands and thousands of years, and they are all built on this understanding that the mind is trainable and workable. If you look at the life of the Buddha, on the one hand, it looks like it has nothing to do with our lives. He lived thousands of years ago. He's in a faraway country from where most of us live, and it feels just totally foreign. But on another hand, he basically tried to do what most of us are trying to do in the modern world. We're trying to have good relationships. We're trying to get enough money. We're trying to, be successful in our careers. And why do we do that? We're doing all of that, of course, because we think it's going to lead to happiness, to some rich, fulfilling life. So he did all of that, and he was successful in all of that, and basically found that it didn't lead him where he wanted to go. He wasn't content. He didn't feel that sense of peace and happiness that he had been looking for. And so that's actually a really helpful thing, because it shows that you can take all of these pursuits that the world tells us we should engage in. We can do all of the things the world tells us we need to do to live rich, fulfilling lives. And it's a false promise that actually doesn't lead to where we hope it will lead. And it's kind of obvious. You can look at the richest people on the planet. You can look at the most powerful people on the planet, the most famous people on the planet, and just ask, are these the happiest people on the planet? Are these the most fulfilled people on the planet? And it's pretty obvious that they're not. So in Buddhism, it's first recognizing that the normal pursuits that we're engaged in just don't work. They're based on an error in the mind, which is that conditions that are fundamentally changing by their nature are going to lead to an experience of happiness that's stable. It's like expecting salt water is going to quench your thirst. It might give you some short-term relief, but ultimately, of course, it just leaves you more thirsty. So first is just recognizing that. And then the Buddha, of course, set out on this quest, and that's his own personal story, is then, well, if that doesn't work, what's the alternative? Is there some other way out of this cycle of stress and dissatisfaction? And basically what he discovered is, yes, that through meditation, through exploring the mind, through living a life of awareness and compassion, you essentially can rewire the mind to suffer less and to flourish more. That's the basic premise of the entire Buddhist tradition. Yeah, no, it's so true. When we hear the word suffering, so there's this Sanskrit term dukkha, which is the word we usually translate as suffering. And it's so true. When you first hear that word, it's like, we're, lying in our bed crying in agony or something like that. But the Buddhist term dukkha is much more subtle. It can be that. It can be really intense pain and agony. But strangely, it can be pleasure. Basically, what it's pointing to is experiences that at a psychological or emotional level are ultimately unsatisfactory, meaning that whatever they might bring ultimately doesn't satisfy our thirst and hunger for contentment and peace of mind. So it's not just pain and suffering, the intense lows of experience. It could be simply that you have an experience of pleasure and it's not going to last. The fact that that experience of pleasure is going to end. So experiences that we usually look to for happiness are fragile. They're fragile because they're based on causes and conditions. And those causes and conditions, when they change, our sense of well-being changes. So in Buddhism, it's not necessarily to demonize all of that. That stuff can still be nourishing at some level. But it's simply to bring our expectations in line with what reality can actually provide. So for example, it's not that we shouldn't have relationships, but we shouldn't expect from our relationships something that they can't give us. Our relationships, as important as they are going to change over time. At some point, we're going to experience loss, for example. So again, the point isn't that relationships are bad, it's only when we have unrealistic expectations about them. And then when we experience loss, we suffer much more than we need to, simply because our expectation was completely out of line with reality. So a lot of it is really around this gap between expectations and reality. And the degree to which our expectations are out of line with reality is really the space of suffering. However big that gap is the space within which our suffering lives. Yeah, so in Buddhism, there's this really classic metaphor of the two arrows. And this is essentially that the first arrow is the normal suffering that comes from being human. There's no version of being human where we don't have physical illness, for example. Just by virtue of having a body, we're going to have some pain, we're going to get old, we're going to suffer at the physical level, we're going to get sick. By virtue of having relationships, we're going to experience some of the challenges with the relationships. We're going to experience loss. So all of that is what you might call natural or innate suffering. It's just the suffering, the pain, the challenges we have from being human. On the other hand, we have what's called the second arrow, which is all of the mental and emotional overlay that happens in response to the suffering of the first arrow. So for example, we might experience loss, and then the degree to which we just can't let go could mean we get just lost in our grief, for example. So years later, we're still suffering, we're still grieving because that initial period of loss has just kind of taken hold in our being and we're not able to move on. So of course, being sad and grieving is a normal thing, but when the emotional part of our lives becomes a little bit too strong in proportion to the actual pain and suffering of that first arrow, that's where things start to get out of balance. We just simply haven't learned to adjust our mental and emotional response to things, and we suffer a lot more than we need to. Yeah, I always feel like it's an unfair critique of Buddhism that it's oftentimes said to be really pessimistic. Of course, there is a lot of focus on suffering, but the whole point of that is that it's possible to not suffer. So in that respect, it's incredibly hopeful. And I always like to think about this as the parallel with the 12-step program. In the modern world, of course, we have a ton of addiction, and with alcoholism in particular, the 12-step program is probably the most famous, at least in the US where I live. It's the most famous way to recover from addiction, and specifically from that particular form of addiction. And what I found a kind of an interesting parallel with Buddhism is that the first and necessary step is you have to acknowledge the problem. And it makes so much sense. If you don't acknowledge that there's a problem, if, for example, you have a problem with alcohol, and you don't recognize that you have a problem with alcohol, you're not going to do anything else. So you have these 12 steps, but you wouldn't follow even a single one of them if you hadn't acknowledged that there's some kind of problem there in the first place. And that's basically the same approach in Buddhism. You need to start by saying that there is something that just is not working in my life right now. I'm doing the same things over and over again, and somehow I'm expecting a different result. So that recognition, that insight, it's not the end of the story, but it's the beginning of the story. In that sense, it's incredibly hopeful and promising, because that recognition that there's a problem, that something isn't working out, that sets the stage for everything that you do in the path of meditation. So once you have that insight that something isn't working and you're motivated to make a change, Then, of course, there's the question of what do you do? And this actually reminds me of so many experiences I had when I was young. I started meditating when I was 19. But before I started meditating, I had this repeated experience where I would read a book, and I loved reading books that were inspiring. And I loved reading about characters who seemed like they had discovered something, or they just represented the best of humanity, or a full, they had fully tapped into their potential as human beings. And I remember, for example, in Les Miserables is one of the books I remember from when I was a teenager, and there's this character of the bishop. And without going into the whole story, he's just this compassionate character, and you can see in the story, he's just radiating compassion. And I had this experience in reading stories like that, where I was inspired, and I guess it kind of sparked in me that interest and that sense of human potential. And I was also a little discouraged, strangely, at the same time, because there was nowhere to go with that. There was nothing to do with that. So it was like that moment that we talked about with the 12-step program. If you acknowledge that you have an addiction, for example, or in Buddhism, you acknowledge that there's something not working, and you just can't get out of this cycle of stress and anxiety or whatever it might be for you. But then if there's no path forward, that recognition is just kind of depressing. It can actually make things worse, because there's nothing you can then do to alleviate whatever that problem might be. So when I encountered meditation first, and then later as I started to learn more about Buddhism, what really made me so inspired and hopeful about that is it wasn't just this new picture of what's possible for us as human beings, but it was how clear the path was. It was so clear that just meeting me exactly where I am. Here's what you can do today, and here's where this leads. So kind of painting this whole picture for how to live a rich, meaningful life, but one that was very attainable and practical for me. So that sense of being able to train the mind and having a clear path was really at the heart of it. And meditation, of course, is part of that, but it's also living an ethical life. It's gaining insight into the workings of the mind. And so it's kind of these key ingredients. It's basically stabilizing the mind through meditation, gaining insight, and living a life grounded in compassion and discipline. So it's basically just the combination of those three things. Yeah, the topic of self is a huge central theme in Buddhist thought. Of course, there's this idea of no self, or anatman. And you could really, in some respects, think of the entire Buddhist tradition simply as an exploration of the self. How do we construct our identity? What do we notice when we start to look at our identity and question that? And ultimately, what is the nature of our identity? Who are we at our core? Everything really is in service of that question. And that question, in turn, is central because the question of how and why we suffer, how we get stuck in patterns of stress and anxiety and overwhelm and dissatisfaction, the answer to that the Buddha discovered is that it all comes down to how we construct our sense of self. And specifically, that we create a distorted, limiting conception of ourselves. And that is really the most fundamental thing that causes and perpetuates this cycle of dissatisfaction and suffering. So you could look at the modern world in a way, the obsession we have these days with not only, humans have always been obsessed with themselves. That I don't think that's anything historically new. But we've taken that to a pretty dramatic level now. If you just look at social media, where it's not only the endless rumination we have about ourselves and our lives, but now we're broadcasting that all over the internet, and we're curating what people see, and that's being mirrored back to us in a million different ways. And we've taken the obsession with the self, and probably a very toxic version of the self, to a degree that's probably quite unique historically. So in Buddhism, it's really just to question that. It's not even necessarily about finding the right answer. It certainly isn't about creating a new belief system about the self. It's really about getting curious about the self, and just asking what actually does lead us towards happiness and well-being. what leads us more in the direction of stress and anxiety and the negative things we experience in life, just so we can see how all of this obsession with the self actually influences our experience and hopefully begin to learn to live in just a more healthy, balanced way. But really it comes back to curiosity at the end of the day, just getting curious about how all of this obsession with ourselves shapes our experience. So in the book, I focus on what are called the three yanas. Yana is a term in Sanskrit that simply means vehicle, something that takes you from point A to point B. And that probably sounds like a weird term to use in a spiritual sense, but what it's meant to convey is that most of us are starting somewhere where we recognize that we want to make a change, like we've been talking about. But how is it that we get to where we want to go? How can we go from feeling that our life is meaningless or unfulfilling, or we're just stressed out and we want to experience more peace of mind or a more purposeful life? What is it that's going to allow us to make that transition? So a yana, in this sense, is just one way to do that. It's the path, maybe is another way to say it. Well, if you look at the history of Buddhism, what you'll see is that Buddhism, of course, started in ancient India. It evolved for almost 1,500 years or so. And during that time, it spread to different parts of the world. So it spread to Southeast Asia, it spread south to Sri Lanka, it spread up into East Asia, into China, eventually to Korea and Japan. And at a certain point, it spread to Tibet. So without totally geeking out in the history of all of this, the fact that it spread to those places at different times means that when it spread to, say, China, it reflected what was going on in ancient India at the time that it spread from India to China. It spread to Southeast Asia at a different time, and it reflected, therefore, what was going on in Indian Buddhism at that time. When Buddhism spread to Tibet, it was at the latest stage, really the final stage before it eventually was wiped out with Muslim invasions about 1,000 years ago in ancient India. And at that time, you basically had this very interesting period in Buddhist history where you had all of these different sects and lineages and approaches and philosophies. They were all being synthesized and integrated. So in earlier stages of Buddhism, you basically had independent lineages, and those lineages would go migrate to different geographic areas. With Tibet, it got the synthesis. It got the stage of Buddhism where all of that was being brought together and woven into one rich tapestry of Buddhist thought and practice. So the three yanas, and I could go on and on, of course, this is the whole topic of the book, but the three yanas reflect that rich tapestry of Buddhism that was transmitted from ancient India to Tibet eventually. This started around the 8th century. So in a nutshell, you could say that the first yana focuses on renunciation, how to reorient the mind away from things like getting rich and chasing pleasure and towards a more spiritual meditative life. And on an ethical level, it's very much focused on not harming other sentient beings. So actually Gandhi's philosophy of ahimsa, or nonviolence, actually that's the very same word. It's ahimsa in Sanskrit, simply means to not harm. So ethically, that's the focus. And then the philosophical orientation, what you might call the view, is focused on the idea of no self, that the self is not solid and permanent and unchanging, but it's much more fluid and dynamic. So I could go through the other yanas, but each of them has their own ethical foundation, their own unique perspective, and their own meditation practices. Yeah, the three yanas, you practice them all together. So for example, I'll actually talk about my own daily practice. So I sat down and meditated today, and you might start in your normal practice, as I did this morning, by going for refuge. Going for refuge is a kind of a weird term, but it's a very central one in Buddhism. It basically means that you're reorienting your mind away from the normal preoccupations we have in life to what is truly meaningful and transformative. And in particular, you reorient your mind to what are called the three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha is basically the teacher, somebody who's going to show you the way to discover your true nature. The Dharma is your path, and the Sangha is your companions. It's the community that supports you on your journey. So you're basically reorienting your mind from just chasing money and success and whatever, and you're thinking about what will lead to some lasting fulfillment in my life. That's what we call the outer refuge. The inner refuge is your own Buddha nature. It's the idea that we all have this potential to be awakened, to be enlightened, in the Buddhist sense. So that's the starting point, and that's very much the first of these three yanas. The act of taking refuge is at the heart of the first of these three yanas. The next thing that I do in my daily practice is bring to mind compassion, or in traditional Buddhist terms, what we call bodhicitta. So I'll actually think to myself, I'm now going to meditate, not only for my own well-being, for my own benefit. I'm going to meditate now so I can do good in the world, so that whatever I do with my life, even whatever I do in this meditation, that not only is this going to benefit others, may this actually help alleviate suffering in the world. May it help them discover their true nature. So you form this compassionate motivation. That is a key part of the second of the three yanas, the Mahayana. And then there's a lot of things I might do after that, depending on what kind of meditation I'm doing. But really, almost every practice that I do in the tradition that I've practiced in, they all come down to recognizing the innate purity of the mind itself. One way to think about this is you're kind of shifting from doing to being. And the understanding is that at our core, the mind is already perfect. It's the surface level of our thoughts and emotions that get very neurotic. But if we can let go and simply be, we start to discover elements of our own consciousness. The nature of our own minds actually is a source of tremendous peace and well-being and wisdom and compassion. So that insight, that awakening, is not some goal we're going to attain. It's actually the nature of who we are in this and every moment. That is the essence of the third yana. So you can see that even in a few minutes of meditation in the Tibetan tradition, you actually combine the insights of all of these different traditions, all of this rich tapestry of Buddhist practice and meditation and philosophy. You can weave all of that into a simple experience that you might do even in a short meditation session. Yeah, I wrote the book really for two primary audiences. My first motivation actually was thinking about my own life as a meditator. As I mentioned earlier, I started meditating when I was 19. I had zero interest in Buddhism, so I meditated for quite a while without learning a lot about Buddhism. And then at a certain point, I started to get curious about that, and I thought, okay, I don't really want to become religious. I don't want to join any new religion. But I can see that these meditation practices seem to be rooted in this Buddhist tradition, and maybe I should check that out and learn what that's all about. But I was a meditator, and I didn't want academic philosophy. I didn't want some intellectual thing. I wanted something that would enrich my meditative journey. So I wrote the book primarily for people like that, who might have been meditating for a bit and they just are curious about Buddhism, what the Buddhist path of meditation is all about, in a way that might give them a little added understanding or a new perspective on the meditation practices they're doing, and perhaps paint a picture of what the Buddhist path of meditation might actually be like for some who might want to actually pursue that. So that's the first group. The second group are people who maybe have been meditating for a while and even have been meditating in the Buddhist lineage for a while. And I think one thing that can happen, even if you've been meditating for a long time, is it's easy to get so wrapped up in the details that you forget the key points. Why are we even doing this in the first place? I'd love to say meditation is just, super simple, but actually there are so many forms of meditation. There's so many philosophies. There's so many names to learn. There's so much history. You can easily spend a lifetime learning all that stuff.
It's like the meta second arrow.
Yeah, it's like the second arrow of the second arrow or something. Exactly. Yeah, so you could spend a lifetime just with all the minutia and completely miss why you're doing it in the first place. So in some respects, that is another aspiration I had. It's that people who've been meditating, I've been meditating more than 30 years. Sometimes you need to be reminded of just what is this all about? And at the end of the day, it's not about altered states of consciousness. It's not about, just some perfected ideal of the mind. It's really quite simple. It's just about living with more awareness, compassion, and wisdom, and recognizing that these are innate qualities that we all have. So, my aspiration is hopefully that people, even who've been meditating a long time, will find a helpful reminder of why we do these practices and hopefully inspire them to keep going. Well, my first and biggest influence has been Mingyur Rinpoche, for sure. I met Mingyur Rinpoche after I'd been meditating for about 7 or 8 years. And I was meditating pretty intensely. Actually, I had moved to Nepal. I ended up living in Nepal, living in Tibetan refugee settlements for almost 8 years. So I was really into meditation. I mean, if you're going to move to Nepal, obviously you're pretty into meditation. So it wasn't as though I was new to meditation or I didn't know what I was doing. I was quite confident, actually, in my practice, and I'd been obviously meditating a while. In the first retreat I ever sat with him and did with him, he cleared away so many misunderstandings that I didn't even know I had about meditation. And the biggest one was that I had been making meditation such a struggle. I had been fighting my mind, and I didn't even realize how much tension I was creating through my meditation. And at the core of it is something he teaches so brilliantly, which is that you can use any experience as a support for meditation. So rather than, for example, you bring awareness to your breath, and then everything else is a distraction from that. So you start thinking, and you're like, oh, I got to come back to the breath. And then you hear a bird chirping, and you're like, oh, back to the breath. Everything else, is basically creating tension because it's the thing you shouldn't be paying attention to. And then there's the one thing you should be paying attention to, which is the breath or a mantra, whatever you're meditating on. And so I was meditating like that, as many of us are. And Mingyur Rinpoche just said the simplest thing. He said, if your mind starts to get distracted and it's naturally getting pulled towards your thoughts or towards that bird or whatever it is, just pay attention to the bird. Just bring awareness to your thoughts and let that be the support for your meditation. That one thing dissolved 98% of the challenge I had in my meditation practice. And you can see he wrote a book called The Joy of Living, and he really is the most joyful person you'll ever meet. And I think a lot of it is just that. There's no problems. When anything and everything in your life, a relationship stress, work stuff is going on, you're stuck in traffic, somebody says something mean to you, whatever it is, you can just use your reactions, the experiences you're encountering. All of that becomes the basis for your meditation practice. Then everything becomes meaningful, everything becomes a source of transformation and self-exploration. So I could say a lot about Mingyur Rinpoche. Obviously, I'm more than a fan of his. But I think that one teaching completely and radically transformed not only my own meditation practice, but really my whole life. So Mingyur Rinpoche definitely is one of my main and most, probably the biggest influence in my life. The other person actually is strangely not a meditation teacher, but I guess you could call him my science guru, which is Richard Davidson, has now become an incredibly close friend and colleague, but also has been an amazing mentor for me. And from him, he's one of the world's most well-known neuroscientists, and I've now worked with him for more than a decade. I think from him, I've learned a very similar thing, but from the point of view of the brain, which is that the brain is giving us constant opportunities to explore our mind and to transform our inner experience. And it's almost some of the same insights that I learned from Mingyur Rinpoche, but showing how our own biology, our nervous system, our brains are actually wired and rewired themselves for this same kind of inner journey of self-discovery. So I think between the two of them, I've had many wonderful teachers, but if I had to pick two people, it's really Mingyur Rinpoche and Richie Davidson have just been profoundly influential in my own life and my own thinking. Well, maybe the easy part first. I first went to Nepal and India for a completely different reason than I ended up staying. So I went really because I had finished a master's degree in Buddhist studies, And my plan at the time was that I was going to go into do PhD work. And in the US, if you do a PhD in religious studies, it's all about languages. Usually you have to know at least 2, sometimes 3, even 4 languages. And I had started to study Tibetan, and I went thinking that I'll study Tibetan for a year, and then I'll come back and I'll do my PhD work. Well, I went there and I did learn Tibetan, and I started translating these ancient texts. And at the same time, I started doing retreats. And I had been doing retreats prior to that as well, but actually it was my time in retreat in the foothills of the Himalayas and the amazing teachers that I met. I met Mingyur Rinpoche. I met a great Dzogchen, true meditation master named Chotra Rinpoche, who ended up living to be 103. He was already in his early 90s when I met him. So I met these amazing masters who just being in their presence was so moving and inspiring. And then I was doing retreats, so that became a huge part of my life. And even the other stuff I was doing, like translating books, I was teaching at a monastery there. Really everything was just so I could be there and keep doing my retreats. So I ended up staying for the better part of 8 years. And the reason I went back was really my work with Mingyur Rinpoche. So I had met Mingyur Rinpoche very soon after I got there. There's a whole long story about getting to know him and eventually receiving teachings from him. But at a certain point, he asked me if I would help him start what is now Tergar, and there's kind of a global meditation community. And I immediately said yes, and started working with him and helping him manifest his vision. And at that time, when we first were doing that, we were going to start an institute, like a year-round institute in Kathmandu. And we were planning to do that for some period of time. I was helping him actually at a monastery that he had in India, but we were planning to move the whole operation back to Nepal. But Nepal, at that time, was in the middle of a civil war, and it was a very dangerous time to be in Nepal. There were some quite scary situations just living there at that time. And so at a certain point, we realized this is just not the time to be setting up a whole, this idea that people were going to fly from all over the world and come there and study. It was just too unstable. We didn't know what was going to happen from one year to the next. And at the same time, Mingyur Rinpoche was traveling all over the world, and he had students all over the world, but there was no community. There was no way for them to connect with each other, to support all of them as a community. And so together we made this decision to focus on his communities outside of Asia, or outside of India and Nepal. And together we founded what has since become the Tergar meditation community, which now has retreats and centers and groups on almost every continent. The first book I would mention as a really influential book for me, which was one of the very first ones I read when I started meditating, is Jon Kabat-Zinn's Wherever You Go, There You Are. That book is so simple in its message. It's just be present, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, just be mindful, be present. He, of course, is like the godfather of mindfulness, in the modern world. And I've gotten to know him quite well over the years, and really just such a genuinely wonderful human being. So that, I think, is one great book, especially for people who are getting started with the practice of meditation or learning about mindfulness. I don't think I could mention inspiring books without mentioning The Joy of Living by Mingyur Rinpoche. That's the book that I mentioned earlier. It was the same message of that book, which is the first teachings I received from him are the ones that totally changed the way I thought about meditation, actually the way I thought about my life in general. And let's see, what else would I mention in addition to that? So this is a very traditional book, and I hesitate to mention it just because it's probably not the first book you want to read, but there's a book called The Words of My Perfect Teacher. It's very traditional. It's written for a very different time and place. But I mention it because it was the first book that really kind of opened me up to the historical roots of the Tibetan tradition. And actually what I really remember about reading that book was the pictures of some of the great masters of the Tibetan tradition in the 20th century. And these are pictures of great Tibetan teachers like Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche. And just seeing those pictures, I don't think I remember anything that I read the first time I read that book. It was all way over my head. It was very traditional. But some of those pictures I will never forget. They're just imprinted on my subconscious, and I think have always stayed with me. So those are 3 books that I definitely would recommend.